Today is February 4th, 2024. The conflict in Ukraine continues. I want to go over recent developments there. I also want to talk about this plan that has been laid out by the US for Ukraine over the course of 2024. But before I do that, I want to go to the map, liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian map. Please keep that in mind as we take a look at it. But nonetheless, it is showing Russian forces on the initiative all along the line of contact. There's no bridgehead to speak of in Kherson, as many had pinned their hopes on, that Ukraine would be able to establish and expand a bridgehead east of the Dnieper River and create the starting point for another offensive toward Crimea, or at least toward cutting the land bridge to Crimea. That is nowhere to be seen on this pro-Ukrainian map. We see Russian forces on the attack in this small salient. This is as far as the Ukrainian offensive got last year, but their goal having been to cut the land bridge all the way to the Sea of Azov. You can see how far short they fell of that. And we can also see heavy fighting all around Avdiivka. You can see Russian forces, again, continuing this process of constricting around the city and also systematically dismantling the defenses within the city. And of course, through the process of attrition, wearing down Ukrainian manpower, equipment, and ammunition. You have to remember that the defenses in Avdiivka are as good as any modern defenses will be along the line of contact. They have been built up since 2014. They have been honed over the years in response to the exchange of fire between Ukrainian forces and separatists in the Donbas region, and now between Ukraine and Russian forces since the beginning of the special military operation in 2022. I also want to show you on the map where reportedly a Russian missile boat was sunk. It was off the coast of Crimea, and more specifically the west coast of Crimea, supposedly somewhere around this lake. And as you can see, this is relatively close to Ukrainian held territory, and it was done through the use of multiple surface naval drones. I have an article from the BBC on this here. Ukraine hits Russian missile boat in Black Sea. The article says Ukrainian forces say they have destroyed a Russian missile boat from the Black Sea Fleet in a special operation off Russian-occupied Crimea. It's a special operation because this is not something Ukraine is capable of doing on a regular basis. It requires an immense amount of planning. It also requires coordination between Ukrainian forces and NATO. NATO is collecting intelligence and targeting information and relaying it to Ukraine to carry out attacks like this. We see attacks like this happen maybe once every 2 to 3 months, and then even more infrequently do they have successes like this. The article also says Ukraine has achieved a series of successes in the war in and around the Black Sea, damaging or destroying Russian warships despite having no fleet of its own. Yet the vast majority of the Russian Black Sea Fleet remains unharmed. It is not playing a pivotal role in the special military operation. However, Black Sea Fleet ships equipped with cruise missiles do regularly fire those missiles at targets all across Ukraine. They're able to do that even after being relocated away from the Crimean Peninsula to take them out of range of these type of drone attacks. So these type of operations and this success that Ukraine has had in the Black Sea is irrelevant in terms of degrading Russian capabilities as part of ongoing operations against Ukraine. It is also relatively insignificant in terms of opening shipping lanes in the Black Sea. We always hear about how Ukraine's success in the Black Sea has allowed them to begin commercial shipping again, but I just want to show you this article here from OECD. Impacts of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine on the shipping and shipbuilding markets. This was November last year. You can just tell by the tone of the title that this is most definitely not a pro-Russian article. And yet, if you look at the graphs that they show, and this is millions of tons here, from 1 to 7 million tons, and this is over the course of the several years, 2019 to 2023, and you could see at the beginning of the special military operation, shipping dropped to almost zero. And then this supposed reopening of the Black Sea looks like this, and you can see that it's still a fraction of pre-war levels. This is primarily a land war. Ukraine's primary problem is a lack of manpower, trained manpower, weapons, and ammunition. Did sinking this missile boat address any of these primary problems? The answer is no. All it did was distract temporarily away from them. Now let's talk about these actual problems Ukraine has and ways some analysts imagine they can be addressed. And let's go to this article by War on the Rocks, titled Hold, Build, and Strike, a Vision for Rebuilding Ukraine's Advantage in 2024. And this was published on January 26, 2024. It's by Michael Kaufman, who I've mentioned often, Rob Lee, and Dara Masakat. And this overall is an exercise of fantasy. Here's the basic premise, though. This is from the article. While the current state of the war has been described as a stalemate, spurring an animated debate over what that means, Russia holds material, industrial, and manpower advantages in 2024, along with the initiative. However, with tailored Western support, Ukraine could hold against Russian forces this year and rebuild the necessary advantage to conduct large-scale offensive operations in 2025, recreating another opportunity to deal Russia a battlefield defeat. And to say this indicates they have learned absolutely nothing from Ukraine's failures last year. What they lay out in this article is not unlike what I presented in my previous update on Ukraine. The Washington Post, I believe, published an article going over a very similar idea proposed by U.S. policymakers. And it was essentially the U.S. plan to support Ukraine throughout 2024 and prepare it for 2025. It's not unusual for people, Michael Kaufman, Rob Lee, Dara Masakat, they're all from these corporate-funded think tanks. They talk to people in the military. The people from the military give them ideas. They give ideas and analysis to people in the Pentagon and in Washington, and it's an entire ecosystem. And what they do is they arrive at consensus by talking with each other, publishing articles like this, interviewing each other at events that these think tanks host, where they bring in members of the military and government. This is how U.S. foreign policy is actually developed. It is not developed by elected representatives. It is determined by unelected policy think tanks funded by corporations who work together with the permanent state in the Pentagon and at the State Department. A reoccurring theme in this article and all across the Western media is this idea that there is some sort of stalemate. They concede that Russia does have many advantages over Ukraine, but you constantly hear them saying they cannot translate those advantages into forward motion on the battlefield. But you have to remember that Russia itself says they're waging a war of attrition. Their goal is to degrade Ukrainian military capabilities. They are eliminating Ukrainian manpower faster than it can be reconstituted. They're forcing Ukraine to expend ammunition quicker than the West can replace it. And they're doing the same thing with weapon systems. Follow that to its logical conclusion. Does Russia need to make forward motion right now while there is still manpower and weapons in somewhat significant quantities on the battlefield? What if they just wait until this process reaches its logical conclusion and then launches their forward their offensive to achieve forward motion on the battlefield. I don't understand why this is a concept that is so difficult to grasp. I don't think that it is. For some reason, they think a lack of Russian territorial gains this year in 2024, somehow that will work out to their advantage. And in reality, if Russia forgoes any sort of major offensive and they continue playing to their strengths, destroying Ukrainian manpower, equipment, forcing Ukraine to expend ammunition, while their manpower, weapons, and ammunition continue to increase in quantities, how is that going to put them at a greater disadvantage come 2025? The article continues. They talk about the logistical and maintenance nightmare Ukraine faces, and then they suggest different ways to overcome it. So this is what the article says. It says, holding is about not just positional defense, but also consolidation. This year can be used to consolidate and rationalize the force. With Western support and transfer of industrial capacity like 3D printing machines, Ukraine can increasingly maintain and produce new components for Western kit. No, they can't. That's not how 3D printing works. I'm sorry. I don't know where they get this type of information. Ukraine has a combination of military and volunteer-run repair and upgrade facilities involved in helping to maintain the force. However, Ukraine received a diverse arsenal of equipment from Western countries with 14 different types of artillery as just one example. And as I pointed out many times, this goes across the board. Main battle tanks, for example, they have a multitude of main battle tanks from all different countries, using all different types of fire control, optics, engines, even ammunition. It says, in 2023, this diversity was further increased with Western tanks, Leopard, Challenger, and Abrams variants, infantry fighting vehicles, various types of mine resistance, ambush protected vehicles, and so on. This makes for a logistical and maintenance nightmare, which reduces the amount of equipment that is serviceable at any one time. Given the critical role played by private charities like Come Back Alive and the Prytula Foundation, greater cooperation between them and Western governments and defense companies would help keep Western equipment serviceable. There's only one way to solve this problem, and it's standardization. There's a reason why militaries standardize their equipment so that they don't have these problems, because these problems are insurmountable. Yes, there's things you can do to try to increase the amount of equipment you have functioning at any given time, but it will always be at a disadvantage to an army that is standardized. So there's no way they're going to fix this problem sufficiently to match or exceed Russian maintenance and logistical capabilities. It will never happen. Then it talks about what holding, building, and striking mean. Holding, they say, holding will require a well-prepared defense, consolidating and rationalizing the Ukrainian armed forces' diverse park of equipment. But as I pointed out, because they're talking about Ukraine building defenses all along the line of contact, forgoing offensive operations, going on the defensive, digging in. And I've already talked about this extensively. They've already dug in all along the line of contact in places like Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, in places like Bakhmut, in places like Avdiivka, where the entire city has been transformed into a fortress, essentially, including with underground complexes. And yet Russia is still whittling these defenses down, circumventing them, cutting them off, isolating them, and eventually killing, capturing, or expelling Ukrainian forces from them. They did this at Mariupol, in the Azovstal Steelworks, a virtual fortress. And what they did was the Russian forces just encircled them, cut them off from their supply lines, and starved them out, and they all surrendered. They talk about building. Building focuses on reconstituting force quality training and expanding defense industrial capacity. If the US and the rest of NATO spent from 2014 to 2022 trying to reorganize the Ukrainian army into a NATO-style maneuver force built on the model of the US Army Brigade Combat Team, introducing the concept of NCOs, and they spent 8 years doing that, reorganizing the Ukrainian army away from its Soviet era strategy and tactics, command structure. If by the beginning of Russia's special military operation, that army was destroyed, and there's nothing really left of it, what are they going to do between now and 2025 that is going to make any sort of difference? They talk about expanding defense industrial capacity. This is easy to say, it's much harder to do. It would be hard to do even if the West was determined to do this. They're not. But let's just say there are efforts to expand Western military industrial production. The problem is Russia already has a head start, and they continue to expand their own military industrial production. They did not just start with an advantage and they're maintaining it. They're constantly working to expand it as well. So this will always be a disadvantage for Ukraine for the foreseeable future. Then it talks about striking. It says, finally, the strike element will degrade Russian advantages and create challenges for Russian forces far beyond the front lines as Ukraine works on rebuilding its capacity to resume offensive operations. Ideally, Ukraine can absorb Russian offensives while minimizing casualties and position itself to retake the advantage over time. Again, this is the long-range missile argument. Give them long-range strike capabilities so they can degrade Russian military production, logistics, everything behind the front line. There will never be enough missiles collectively across the entire West that can be transferred to Ukraine and used to do this. I just got done talking about just Crimea, how impossible it will be for Ukraine to disrupt logistics to and from Crimea, to isolate Crimea. If they cannot even do that regarding Crimea, how are they going to do that across the rest of Russia, the largest country by land area on the planet? Then they go into all of these areas much deeper. They talk about training Ukrainian forces. They say, working with Western countries, Ukraine can scale up and reform existing training programs, restoring combat effectiveness to its forces. No, they cannot. No, they cannot do that. This means expanding local training efforts, revising Western programs, combining training materials, and looking for ways to address the growing deficit of professional military education for officers and junior leaders. These programs need to include not just the tactical requirements of Ukraine's combat operations, but also the ability to operate as units and staff training for the brigades. Although Ukrainian servicemen and officers have significant combat experience, they often lack training in the fundamentals, which becomes a greater problem as they are swiftly promoted to replace combat losses. Right there, they're talking about officers and NCOs dying and their subordinates being swiftly promoted to take their place. They do not have all the experience and training of that NCO or officer who perished in the fighting. They're just filling the gap because there is no one else to take their place. And that is a problem that no amount of training is a substitute for. There is no substitute for experience. The experience required over years to effectively fill that position. And these analysts are taking for granted the amount of time and effort and energy that goes into standing up a military unit the size of a brigade. This is not something you could just stand up in a year or even 2 years. So the idea of doing this over the course of just 2024 into 2025, this is fantasy. It's as much of a fantasy as the idea Ukraine was going to build up brigades ahead of the 2023 offensive. We could see how that turned out. This plan is essentially the exact same plan, maybe adding another 6 months of training, when in reality, rebuilding brigades takes years to do. And then it says company, battalion, and brigade commanders and their staffs cannot be properly trained in a short period of time, which further necessitates looking to 2025 for Ukraine's next strategic offensive. This is the problem. You have attrition consuming Ukrainian manpower at a rate that makes it impossible to reconstitute these units the size of a brigade. That is impossible to do in the middle of a war. You cannot build brigades out of thin air in the middle of a war when your attrition is this bad. If NATO was not able to create an army to effectively fight Russia between 2014 and 2022. They're not going to be able to do it between now and 2025. Then it talks about the military industrial production and overcoming shortages of essential munitions like artillery shells. It says Ukraine can work with Western partners to significantly increase production of drones as well as counter-drone electronic warfare systems that will allow it to partially offset deficits in artillery ammunition and reduce its vulnerability to future disruptions in aid. Ukraine can produce first-person view strike drones in large numbers, but they require funding and ammunition for them, which is a problem that is much easier to solve with Western help than the slowly increasing production of 155mm rounds. European nations could find drone production facilities in Ukraine or in bordering states. This could partially compensate for the lack of artillery ammunition being provided. Larger quantities of mines, including artillery-fired scatterable mines, would also strengthen Ukrainian defenses. Yeah, of course, more of everything would certainly help strengthen Ukrainian defenses, but where is it coming from? That is the question. And I'm going to get into this concept of augmenting your artillery shortage with FPV drones here in just a minute. I'm going to show you how absurd this idea actually is. Elsewhere it says, one of the key challenges for the prospects of future Ukrainian offensives is artillery ammunition availability. Ukraine was able to achieve a fire rate of approximately 225,000 artillery shells per month last summer, more than twice the approximate 90,000 rounds it fired per month last winter. However, that was only made possible by a likely one-time transfer of artillery shells from South Korea to the United States to backfill deliveries to Ukraine. This was actually made possible by one-time deliveries of whatever everyone had left in their stockpiles, whatever they could spare in this one-time delivery ahead of the offensive, they transferred it to Ukraine. That is what allowed them to achieve that rate of fire. And they will never be able to do that again. Not for the foreseeable future. Even with that ammunition, the President Joe Biden administration was forced to release cluster munitions to extend Ukraine's offensive into the fall. Arguably, these would have made the most difference ahead of the offensive. Western artillery production capacity is not sufficient to meet Ukraine's expenditure rates, even just for defensive purposes, necessitating continued deliveries of cluster munitions from stockpiles to close the gap this year. And this whole idea of surging ammunition to Ukraine ahead of their offensive, hopefully achieving some sort of breakthrough, could have possibly worked if Russian manpower, equipment, and ammunition levels weren't as high as they were. But let's just say they did achieve some sort of breakthrough using this strategy. The whole point is it's a one-time surge. You cannot repeat it. And after the surge, you have no more artillery shells left to send Ukraine. So they achieve this breakthrough. They extend the line of contact all the way to the Sea of Azov. They've extended their logistics lines, and now they're out of artillery ammunition. Then what do? I don't think they're thinking these things through all the way. Then it says, since Ukraine was unable to overcome Russia's defenses last summer with a quantitative advantage with artillery ammunition, the prospects for future offensives will be worse unless Ukraine and its supporters can compensate by developing other advantages. This means that the volume of artillery fire will have to be supplemented with drones and other precision strike capabilities in the future. But there is a fatal flaw in this argument. The authors of this article, for some reason, this is what they think the correlation of forces looks like. They think this is the artillery rate of fire here. Here's Ukraine, here's Russia. They're admitting Russia has a higher artillery rate of fire. They have more shells that they can fire every single month than Ukraine. And this is what they actually think will happen. You just add some FPV drones and some other things. That's what the plus sign there means. Maybe some HIMARS or something else. Maybe these small ground launch, small diameter bomb munitions that they're sending. They think the correlation of forces will look like this and they can even it out. But this is fundamentally flawed because the correlation of forces actually looks like this. Not only does Russia have a significant advantage over Ukraine in terms of artillery shells, they also have a significant, at least a 2-to-1 advantage over Ukraine in terms of FPV drones, and an advantage in quantity and quality regarding many other types of long-range precision strike capabilities. So the idea of augmenting Ukrainian artillery rate of fire with drones is fundamentally flawed. Drones perform one task on the battlefield, artillery rounds another. You're going to take the drones away from those tasks to supplement your artillery shells. You're still going to be firing fewer shells and have fewer drones involved in this process than Russia. Plus, Russia has more drones. They could use half of their drones to augment their artillery fire to maintain that advantage they have, and they'll still have a significant number of drones to use for what those drones are actually meant to be used for on the battlefield. So what they're suggesting is Ukraine take one deficiency and transform it into 2 deficiencies. That's what they're fundamentally suggesting here, and I think you can see how flawed that actually is. Then the article says, although Ukraine's summer offensive failed to achieve its minimum goals, Russia's winter offensive last year and lackluster attacks this fall also failed to achieve a breakthrough. The year 2023 ended with Russia taking marginally more territory than Ukraine, but it is still far from its official goal of seizing the entire Donbas. Territorial control is one measure of progress toward one's objective, but the balance of attrition, capacity for reconstitution, defense industrial mobilization, and the ability to employ force effectively at scale are more important determinants of long-term success. And in each case, Russia has the advantage. And what they're not understanding, because they have a one-dimensional view of this fighting, is that Russia is not trying to take territory right now. Yes, their goal is to secure the entire Donbas, but they are doing it in steps. There's a logical way to approach this. You don't just build an offensive force and throw it at a prepared defense if you have the capability of diminishing those defenses and then launching your offensive. It's a very logical way to approach this. That looks to be the way Russia is approaching this, and yet these analysts who are paid salaries and have a significant amount of resources to assist them in their analysis, for some reason they cannot understand this. So there's this fundamental misunderstanding of the entire conflict and how Russia is approaching. That's one problem. But I would say the most telling misconception of all that I see repeated in this article by these particular analysts and across the US foreign policy think tank circles is this belief that the West is inherently superior to Russia. They're just better at innovating than Russia, period. That is just a given. The article actually says Western defense companies are more innovative than Russia's defense industry, but they need the proper demand signals from Western governments to become more engaged. Where do we see greater innovation by the West anywhere in this entire conflict? I don't see any examples at all of an area where the West just completely surpasses Russia. I don't see it anywhere. We always hear about how superior, say, the Leopard 2 or the M1 Abrams is to the T-90M Russian main battle tank. We always hear about that. We always hear about how great HIMARS is compared to multiple launch rocket systems produced by Russia. And we always hear about how the M777 is by far superior to any artillery system Russia has produced. But if you've made it too complicated and too expensive to manufacture in large enough numbers to actually win the war, then it is an inferior system. That is one of the qualities of the weapon system, the ability to manufacture it in large enough numbers to win on the battlefield. I always hear this argument from people talking about World War II and trying to claim that Nazi Germany had better tanks, but Russia beat them because they had more of everything. And there's this quote attributed to Joseph Stalin that goes something like, quantity has a quality of its own. And when you really think about it, if you've ever been involved in industrial design or engineering, you will understand that when you're listing the specifications of a particular system, your ability to mass produce it or the inability to mass produce it is part of its overall specs. And if you cannot mass produce it, that is a limitation of the design. That actually makes the design inferior to one that may not be as impressive on paper, but is capable of being built in large enough numbers, is reliable on the battlefield, and overwhelms the enemy. That is all that really counts. That is what makes a weapon system superior. And in that case, as we can clearly see, Russia has the overwhelming advantage in this regard. The article also says, yet despite the ability to out-innovate and outproduce Russia, where is the West outproducing Russia? It is Moscow that has leapt ahead in scaling production of drones and mobilizing its defense industrial base. There we go again, this belief that the West is just inherently better, and yet they're admitting that Russia has all the advantages. How does that happen? How do you explain that? And then again, despite repeatedly claiming the West is superior at innovating than Russia, they admit this. They say, following Russian adaptation to high mobility artillery rocket systems, HIMARS, fire strikes against logistical nodes, the West may have to come up with other ways to degrade the Russian rate of fire or reduce its efficacy. Russian electronic warfare improvements have reduced the effectiveness of NATO-provided global positioning system guided munitions, such as the HIMARS. I think they also talk about the Excalibur GPS-guided artillery shell, which also needs to be addressed with future precision-guided munition deliveries. The planning should not only evolve based on the experience in 2023, but it should also be cognizant of the adaptations and technological innovation on the battlefield that could increase or offset those requirements. So again, the West is better, Excalibur is better, HIMARS is better, yet somehow Russia's managed to check them on the battlefield while they have their own precision-guided weapons that seem to still be very effective because the West does not have these electronic warfare capabilities. I would say that this is their fatal flaw. And this is why all of their other analysis falls so far short of grasping reality. They start with this premise that the West is inherently superior, and they build everything on top of that. Then the article says, Russian leadership is now visibly overconfident. They see the current trend line in this war as favoring them. Hence, the next year will prove important in demonstrating that even at the peak of its defense spending and defense industrial output, Russia is still unable to achieve its objectives in this war. Meanwhile, the costs will mount, and ideally, it is Moscow that will face growing uncertainty in 2025. Now, this statement falsely assumes that Russia's military-industrial base is not planning to continue expanding past 2025. I don't think that that's true. I think all evidence suggests that Russia, for years before the special military operation began in 2022, was preparing for a large-scale, intense, protracted conflict. I do not believe they thought this was going to be over soon. They were preparing for this to drag on for years. And you can see at this juncture all of the advantages they hold over the collective West, not just the United States, but the entirety of the West. So we can see in this article fundamental flaws laid out by these US government and corporate funded think tank analysts. They never question why this war is being fought in the first place. They never question the US role in this war in the first place. If they wanted to solve what is an unwinnable war for the United States and Ukraine, they would have to admit that US foreign policy is flawed. This war should never have been fought in the first place. The reason it's being fought in the first place is because the US overthrew the Ukrainian government in 2014. After years and years of NATO expansion up to Russia's borders, they fashioned the resulting client regime they installed into power into a battering ram to be used against Russia. Russia has legitimate national security concerns, and they launched the special military operation in response to what the US was doing in Ukraine, right on Russia's borders. This was all spelled out in detail, by the way, by the RAND Corporation's 2019 paper, Extending Russia. They talked all about providing lethal aid to Ukraine, and how it was meant not to save democracy in Ukraine, but how it was all a means of overextending Russia, to collapse Russia, essentially, so that the US could, just as it has done all across Europe, successfully politically capture Russia as well. And then all of this is supposed to add to the US policy of encirclement and containment of China, that their ultimate objective. The only solution for the United States and its Ukrainian proxies is to try to end this war as quickly as possible, to admit that it resulted from US provocations, and for the US to finally address Russia's national security concerns. That is the only way to actually end it. But the people in Washington, the people in these think tanks, they're incapable of admitting fault. They, as you can see, they believe the West is fundamentally superior. And when you're fundamentally superior, everyone else is wrong. You're never the one that is wrong. So they will never admit this mistake, and they will just continue proverbially digging their hole and pushing all of Ukraine into it. We'll have to keep an eye on all of this. I'm sure as 2024 unfolds, all of these things that I've pointed out as tremendously flawed in this article will make themselves very apparent, very apparent. And in the meantime, I will keep an eye on developments in Ukraine. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing to my channel. It's free to do, and it helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I highly suggest you follow me on Telegram. Absolutely everything is posted there, including backups of all my videos. Check the video description for all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you could help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of my social media platforms. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been, thank you very much. That's what makes this work possible, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or even if you're just helping share my work, getting the word out there. That's greatly appreciated. So again, thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.